worries are always part of it.
Half the game. I dare say though, Sebastian, we are there. I've pushed record. I seem to still be moving, which is a good sign.
Yay.
I'm going
Excellent.
to skip over to. Okay, so now I'm back on Google Meets. You can see me okay. You can hear me okay.
Yes.
Beautiful.
Yes.
Oh,
And
super.
yes.
Well, we've got a small, minimal delay, I'd say, but I think it's manageable and working okay. And uh,
Fine for me.
we'll
Should
power
work.
through it. Okay, super. Well, today is a very well. I'll start again. It's the first podcast back in a very long time, and today is the conversation with the wonderful Dr. Sebastian Schulz, Dr. Sebastian Marincolo, a philosopher, PhD in consciousness research, multiple book author, prolific expert and professional in the cannabis industry, and today Sebastian's very kindly offered to walk us through a pretty niche area of debate which I guarantee most people will not have heard before, and we'll cover a couple of topics including consciousness, agnotology, and as well some of the corporate challenges that maybe exist in the cannabis industry as well, Sebastian, that we've mentioned briefly between us as well. So, to let everyone know who you are, Sebastian, would you mind giving us a little rundown of your background, some of the lovely work that you've done over the few years that you've been, well, quite a few years that you've been researching in this field, and we'll jump into some of the research topics you've looked at and obviously talk about books, cannabis industry, current events, that sort of thing. But yeah, if you could start us off, Sebastian, let everyone know who you are. That would be really super, and we'll dive in.
Sure, I'll do it. Thanks for having me, first of all.
Pleasure, thank
I'm
you.
really glad to be here with you and to have the opportunity to talk about my research, my books, and about the current state of the industry and the legalization. Um, it's an exciting time to be in, I guess. Well, I've been on a long journey. So I started as a philosopher to look into the cannabis high as an altered state of consciousness in the late 90s. Um, so I studied philosophy in Germany and in the United States, in North Carolina, and I did research there too. And I completed my PhD in Germany at the University of Tübingen, a very old university and traditional university with a strong philosophy department. And I was lucky that they had good exchange relationships to the US, where I could then go to study with really important philosophers such as William G. Lycan and Simon, the English philosopher Simon Blackburn, author of the Oxford Dictionary of Philosophy, and others. And I was always interested in the philosophy of mind and in human consciousness, questions like philosophical questions like could computers develop consciousness one day, for instance, and what is human consciousness and how does the brain manage to produce such a thing, if it is a thing or a process. So that's what started me, and since I was like 16, 15, I was thinking about those things. And during my research for my dissertation thesis, which was in the late 90s, I started using cannabis again, and I thought, actually I met a guy in the States, a toxicologist, and we shared an apartment, and we started conversations on how the cannabis high affects cognitive functions such as memory, pattern recognition, and other functions which we're going to talk about soon. And I thought, wow, that is like a really interesting thing to research, not only to find out more about the cannabis high, but also to find out about consciousness itself. human consciousness, and I always called that the Alice in Wonderland route to understanding human consciousness. As a little background, there a lot of consciousness research was propelled because of two world wars, and especially First World War, where a lot of people came back with brain damages, and they showed weird phenomena, psychologically speaking, and in terms of the way they would emotionally react to others, and etc. So that showed a lot, and gave researchers an opportunity to look into how the mind works better, because they could see how various breakdowns affected human thinking. And I think research of psychoactive substances such as cannabis or LSD or other substances allows us also to, it's like a door where we can walk through and see things happening in the human mind, and to give us a better understanding of the architecture of the human mind itself. So it's not only a research about the altered state of consciousness, but it's also research about consciousness itself. So without having said that, I, of course, when I completed my PhD in neurophilosophy, I thought, okay, I need to research this, and I wanted to go more into study the cannabis high, and look at the whole spectrum of cognitive changes, cognitive enhancements that I had encountered myself and discussed with others. And of course, very soon I was a little bit naive in the beginning, because I still tried to get money and grants for that, but it was pretty early on clear that I would have to wreck my academic career, so to say, to do that research. And then I worked on my first book, which is High Insights on Marijuana, which was almost like a dissertation thesis for years. And I started financing that with my positions as a creative director in an agency, and as a consultant for communications and marketing for foundations, etc. And then I kept on publishing books, and I kept on until publishing popular science books, in which because I think that was my learning curve. In the beginning, they were a bit more academic, and then I thought, okay, I gotta do something that people really pay attention to this, because it's A, highly stigmatized, and B, it's very complicated. And so I managed to break it down, and I produced a coffee table book in 2013 in Germany, which is High, das positive Potenzial, the positive potential of cannabis, or marijuana, that was in the title still. And that was 7 essays plus a photo series, where I tried to use some rhetorical tricks in the photo series, and to make people pay attention to the subject. And that worked pretty well. That propelled me in the national media here, and I think it also played a part in, because I really managed to get through to an audience of millions with public appearances on television and in radio and everywhere in print media. So I think I played a little bit of a part then also for what you see now in Germany, which is that people are opening up more to the idea of legalization for adult use, for responsible adult use, but also the medical, the change in the medical law in 2017, which opened up a big market. And I was consistently working on my books. I've published now, let's say, 4.5 books or 5 books on the cannabis high, and in English and in German. And but then in the last years, I managed to play a role in the cannabis industry. There was more money coming in that direction, and I used my experience both as an expert on the psychoactive effects of cannabis, as well as my ability, which I had learned in my freelance jobs and in my jobs as a creative director before for agencies, to work as then proceed to working as a director of communications and marketing for one of the biggest cannabis producers in the world in Germany, and so that's where I got to know a lot more about um, the pharmaceutical world and about the medical side of cannabis use, which helped me a lot in my research to understand more about. We're going to talk more about the endocannabinoid system. That's what got me to the point where I am now. So, as you see, a long, winding journey, but I think it was worth it. And I'm at a point now where I published my new book, Elevated, Cannabis as a Tool for Mind Enhancement, which
Mm.
in which I come up with hypotheses about, amongst other things, hypotheses about the endocannabinoid system, which is based on my research, which I think is probably should be considered by some researchers in the field, because it might turn out that the endocannabinoid system is a lot more important than we've thought so far to complex cognitive abilities.
Question for you then, Sebastian, and thank you for that lovely intro. You mentioned their mind enhancement. What does that mean within the context of your book? People might have heard of cognitive enhancement. There's a lot of talk now around sort of performance drugs that people are maybe using recreationally or at work to maybe improve their productivity. How and what sort of mind enhancement have you observed through the use of cannabinoids?
Yeah, that is an excellent question, and it's excellent the way you put it, because the way you put it reflects our general attitude towards cognitive enhancers, also called nootropics. And if you look at the Greek word nootropic, it means mind and changing more. So it's a more open concept. It's not performance enhancing, strictly speaking. I think we usually think of nootropics or cognitive enhancers as drugs or substances that induce a state of wakefulness, and you are more alert, you are more able to concentrate over a long time, like amphetamines or others,
Yeah.
and you stay concentrated on and focused and awake for a longer time. Takes away, drowsiness, or if you're sleepy. And those substances have been used, for instance, in the Second World War for fighter pilots. And so we're thinking cognitive enhancers are going under a prototype. That is not really what the Greek word suggests, and we're going back also with our research not only on cannabis, but even more so when it comes to psychedelics, to a broader notion of cognitive enhancement, which, for instance, would be an enhancement of your ability to imagine things. So if you look at sleep as an altered state of consciousness, nobody would sleep as an enhanced state of mind, or an enhancement of various cognitive abilities, but it is. If you look at your ability during dreaming of holding an image in your attention, producing like vivid imagery and imagination, which also has been used by artists like for instance, the Spanish painter Salvador Dali and others, who induced those states of sleep to come up with dream images. You find an enhancement use that wouldn't go with a prototype of what we usually think of enhancements. Now, back to my research, when it comes to cannabis, I've looked into literally hundreds of anecdotes and reports and literary reports of cannabis users in the past, from hundreds of years ago, from decades ago, from now, from the present. And I looked into studies and medical research, and so I created my own approach to all that, a scientific approach to come up with more evidence for that, looking into what people reported of those broadly speaking, enhancement functions for
Right.
them. And so the what comes out of that is something that is very similar to what comes out of if you look at the medical use of cannabis. And there is a huge spectrum. I mean, there are dozens and dozens of indications for which you can use cannabis productively, you know, from Tourette's syndrome to epilepsy
Yeah.
to sleep disorders to you name it, morbus Crohn, etc. Um, and sorry, it's Crohn's disease in English, right? In German, morbus Crohn. And so, why is that? We know that the the endocannabinoid system is involved in so many regulatory processes in the body and in the mind that uh, cannabinoids, given externally from outside, plant cannabinoids or synthetic cannabinoids, affect that system in various ways, and therefore you can have various functions altered and maybe enhanced. So when you look at the enhancements, you also see a really broad spectrum. And it's interesting to see that many people, even those who are using cannabis, they kind of have this prototype in their mind of dazed and like a happy, they would characterize the high as a state of being happily dazed and confused. You know, it's a
Right.
little bit of euphoria, but I'm more dazed and confused. I'm not really mentally functioning, which can happen if you overdose or if you have degraded material, etc., etc. It happens a lot, and some people use it because of that to de-stress, etc.
Okay.
But if you look at more intelligent users and people who have used cannabis for various uh, creative activities or for insights or etc., there are many users actually out there, then you can come up with a whole, and I can produce a whole list, and I've done so, of cognitive enhancements. And I'm going to give you like 20, I'm just going to give
Please,
you a
yeah.
short here if you like.
Yeah, please. That'd be super.
So A, there's a hyper, and which is a very, I think, fundamentally effect, a hyper focus of attention. So this is why people with attention deficit disorders are using cannabis, because for many of them it helps them to focus their attention. Now that's a long story because it's something that helps with selective attention, but doesn't necessarily have to help them with sustained attention. What
Okay.
does that mean? That means that when you're high and you concentrate on, let's say, drinking a glass of wine, you suddenly focus on the nuances in the wine and you're very hyper focused. But it could also be that you're very jumpy in thinking. I call it a jumpy hyper focus. That means you're hyper focused on whatever comes into your attentional field. So we talk, we're hyper focused on what we're talking about, and suddenly you see something, or you get another idea. You're hyper focused on and then you're remembering something. You're hyper focused on the memory.
Mm.
So it doesn't have to be that you have a sustained focus of attention, which is for some people difficult with a high, that they become jumpy, but whatever they jump on, they're hyper focused on it. So that's a different story, how to really stay focused on something. That's something we can talk about, but it's very clear that a lot of what comes in cognitive changes comes out of a hyper focus of attention during a high. So that's one. Then with it, you have an intensification of sensory experience.
Mm.
So if you're hyper focused on the wine, of course you have a more uh, intense sensory experience of the nuances of the wine itself. Or kissing somebody, you have a more intense feeling of the kiss. You have a feeling, what comes with it, third, is the feeling of awe, which is something my friend Jason Silva very often emphasizes, and which I think is really important also to emphasize, because the feeling of awe is, as Aristotle said, the start of all philosophy. If you look at the tree and you're like, okay, that's a tree, I have to go around it to go there, or whatever, their apple. But if you start having that feeling of awe, then you start investigating. What is it? Oh, look at the shades, look at this, look at that, and you can start an investigation. So very often during a high, you get that feeling, you're hyper focused, and you start have that feeling of awe at you're taking a bath, a mineral bath, and you're like, holy cow, that feeling is something that's divine, suddenly. And that can be a very important enhancement. Now, then you have a meaningful, what I call a meaningful redirection of attention. For instance, very short example, we talk now, and we are very hyper focused on the content of our discussion. But when I have a redirection of my attention to your bodily signals, I might be more able to understand that, oh, Chris is now starting nervously shaking, so he wants me to move on with my conversation or something. So nonverbal behavior happens very often, that people, when they're high, say that they're shifting their focus of attention, which brings them great insights or leads to other things. So meaningful redirection of attention to all kinds of things, for instance, bodily signals very often. Then we have a greater acuity in perception, which is, like I said, when you have your hyper focus on something, like you go in the Van Gogh Museum or in a museum in Amsterdam, and you watch a Van Gogh painting, and you focus on it more, and you don't focus on the music, whatever people are saying, then you will see more details in that painting. You may see more nuances in the colors, which is really important. Synesthetic experiences are an enhancement, which are very important actually to explain others, but I'm not going to go too much into that because I want to give you a run through. The synesthetic experiences are a very interesting topic when it comes not only to cannabis, but also to other psychoactive substances like LSD.
Could I ask
Um,
Sebastian what are synesthetic
Synesthetic
experiences?
experiences, the most common type of synesthetic experience is when you hear a guitar solo and you see colors associated with it. For
Hmm.
instance, or people on LSD, for instance, have described that they walk through a door and they touch the metallic uh, doorknob, and they have a gustatory taste experience. Um, so it's the crossover of experiences in your mind, and that which might form from a neurophysiological view. Some neuroscientists like Villainur Ramachandran have argued that synesthetic experiences might be very important for creativity. We see, for instance, there are natural synesthetes like Vladimir Nabokov, the writer, or Shostakovich, the composer, who were natural synesthetes, and I think they had a grapheme to color synesthesia, which is a really interesting form, where they would see black and white letters, and they would see the letters each as colored. So if you're a
Huh.
synesthete, a grapheme to color synesthete, for your whole life, you're going to see, let's say, the T as a letter. You would see that associated with red. Even if it's written black, you see the T as always as red in a word. Which doesn't mean that we all see, if you are a synesthete and I am a synesthete, it might be that you see it as red consistently all over your life, and I see it as green. So there are interesting forms of synesthesia, but let
Hmm.
me not go into too
Wow.
much now.
Yeah.
Um, then another really important thing that you read over and over again in reports is the enhancement of episodic memory retrieval. So very often when we talk about cannabis, we talk about the breakdown, so to say, of short-term memory, where you feel like, oh, what did I just say? Where was I? Where you're losing the thread in a conversation, for instance. But what we're not talking about is the um, the enhancement of long-term memories, like memory retrieval, where people get high, happens also with LSD or other substances, where they suddenly have a very vivid recollection of something they may have never remembered before, of an event in their childhood or something um, that happened years before, and suddenly they feel like, wow, I can relive that experience, which can be incredibly valuable. For instance, if you talk about traumatic
Hmm.
experiences and go through that experience again, it could be horrifying as well, but it could be really valuable also, and has a great therapeutic potential. Um, then you have the, what I already mentioned, intensified imagination. intensified imagination is very often underestimated in two aspects, which is A, imagination, we always think of images, but imagination can also be auditory or tactile. So if if somebody wants to cook a meal or come up with a new recipe for a dessert, and he can imagine how that kind of dark chocolate would work with that kind of big orange and that kind of mango juice. If you can imagine the taste, not the image, the
Yeah.
taste better, then your imaginative ability might help you to come up with a recipe. Now, we think of imagination, the second aspect is that we think of imagination very often also in terms of, that's for creative people. No, it's for all of us, because and that's what I learned also from neuroscientists, from Michael Gazzaniga, is that if you and I want to make a decision, if I ask you, Chris, do you want to go with me on a plane and we parachute out of it, and we jump out of it and with parachutes, lovely thing. Your decision will be based on imagination.
Mm.
You will
Visualize it.
imaginatively, what will it be like with that nut?
Yeah.
And jump. You look down 3 kilometers and have a parachute and jump down, and you're going to be like, hell. Either you're going to be like, hell yeah, that sounds fun, or you probably go like, or maybe you go like, Sebastian, let's just keep on talking. So imagination is something that's really important, and there are so many reports about how it can be enhanced. We underestimate very often how this can play out in other enhancements, and I'm going to come to that in a second. Mind racing is another number 9 on my list here, and mind racing is something that many people have reported, both positively and negatively, where they think, wow, I'm speeding up, I'm racing through memories, ideas, or whatever. And for some, they feel like it's very productive for creative production or for thinking things through. For some, they feel like, this is uncomfortable, I feel exhausted after it, etc. So, and that's an interesting thing, because mind racing doesn't seem to happen with all the varieties of cannabis. Sometimes it seems to be more calm high. Sometimes it seems to you seem to really race. Which brings us to distortion of time perception, which has to do with mind racing. That's a complicated thing, because the distortion of time perception, why is that a mind enhancement, you might ask? Because, if my perception of time gets distorted, that's something that's confusing, right? So yes, it is, and yes, it can, for instance, be dangerous in traffic, driving a car, or in other situations. But it can also be very productive. For instance, if you have a very pleasurable experience, it's a hot summer day, and you jump in a lake in cold water, and you have that experience, and you feel it in slow motion, and you're so out of time that it takes an eternity. Or during a sexual experience, it might be the same thing, that you feel like, wow, this is taking an eternity, and this is very pleasurable, and this is something that actually extends the treasures of experience in my life, or that enhance that. So that is an interesting topic as well, but of course observed by many people. The of time perception usually is something where people feel the perception is prolonged. Sometimes it goes the other way around. Complicated subject, but let's keep it at that. There is, I'm at number 12 now from my list of 20. I think there are some more, but let's go through that. Enhanceability of language understanding, which is also something that many people have observed. For instance, when you're speaking or listening to a foreign language, that suddenly you are in that other language and you understand it much better, or that you suddenly get more nuances in a language. You're reading a book and you feel like, I've read beautiful reports on a website, marijuana-uses.com, which was the website of Lester Grinspoon, with whom I collaborated with on a book project, and who became a close friend of mine, he he collected a lot of anecdotes which formed the basis of my work. And there is also a story about a guy who, first of all, a guy who was illiterate and in the 70s, and who started reading little just words, and he couldn't connect the words really to a sentence and to a thought. And he was reading words, and then he got high, and at that level, he felt that for the first time he understands the sentences, and he has imagery going with it, so he
Hmm.
can really read the sentences and enter that world that was described by it imaginatively. So again, we have the imagination in there, and and others feel like they understand a foreign language better, or they speak it better, or they understand the nuances better of what people want to express. So there are all kinds of interesting effects of enhanced the enhanced ability of language understanding. Um,
Gosh.
13, 13 on my list is something that has been described over and over and over again too as an enhanced body perception, where a lot of people say, oh, and I know that for myself, and we all know that we are working on computers a lot. Then you high, and suddenly you feel your body very strongly, and you feel that stiffness in your neck, and you feel like, gosh, how could I suppress that feeling for such a long time, because I'm stiff in the neck and I need to get off the computer and stretch or do my yoga. And so you have and you drink a sip of water while you're high, and you feel like it's going down your throat, and you feel internal processes much better, and you feel like, and we all know also from neurosciences that we have a system in the brain where you're mapping your body. So you have internal sensors, so to say, and a body mapping system, and probably this one becomes enhanced or stimulated, and we already have the beginnings of research on that, how this might become stimulated when you have external cannabinoids hitting those receptor targets. Um, then you have an interesting fact that people usually don't talk about when it comes to cognitive enhancement is mood modulation.
Hmm.
Um, let's just take one thing. We know that cannabinoids like CBD, but also THC in lower doses, can highly probably help with anxiety and fear. Now, that opens up the possibility for many people, for instance, to remember a traumatic experience.
Right.
If you're less fearsome, if your anxiety level goes down, you might start talking, or you might start remembering a traumatic experience, or you start talking about something that's more taboo, or you start talking or thinking about your own death or sickness, which you usually don't want to touch mentally, so to say, because you're like too afraid to think of those things, or to think of breaking up with your girlfriend or whatever. And suddenly, when your mood changes, this might help you. This might be a great cognitive enhancement, or an enhancement for your mind enhancement, to move on with your thinking to corners that you usually don't touch, and which could actually help you with your personal development.
Hmm.
Then, so that was number 14. Now we're at 15, enhanced introspection. A lot of people have reported that they are more able to um, introspect and reflect better on who they are, what they're feeling right now, etc. So that's, from a philosophical point of view, a very interesting ability, and it's also closely related to another one which I have focused a lot on, an enhancement, which is the enhancement of empathic understanding. Now, a lot of people have described this, that they have empathic insights during a high, that they can read facial expressions better, that they are more able to take the perspective of their partner, of their kids, of their whatever people who they are talking to. And in 2010, I predicted that because of that, because normal users described that actually we should look into using cannabis for autism.
Hmm.
and autistic spectrum disorders. And since then, I had so many conversations. We might talk more about that later. From with parents from autistic children, when I first came up with that hypothesis for myself, I was unaware of the fact that Lester Greenspoon, who I had started working with already, had advised parents of autistic children to use cannabis with great success, because they show not only do they become calm and less aggressive, but they become a lot more engaging in social interaction. They You get a lot more eye contact, and they start behaving in ways that are radically advanced to what you see before.
Mm.
And in terms of social interaction, so that's a really important and
Blimey.
interesting
Yeah.
thing to look into. Connected with that, the enhancement of sexual experience. Of course, that could have to do with a lot of other enhancements that I just talked about. You connect to your body better. You have more intense bodily feelings. The time perception is
Yes, it's
changed.
a combination of everything now when you
So
go.
now I'm moving down now to the most complicated cognitive abilities, which is empathic understanding, introspection, etc. And now that I started with the more, basic, which are still complicated. I mean, but hyper focus of attention is something very complicated to do for a system, but still it's more basic. But then you can see how those enhancements and cognitive changes play into the bigger enhancements. If we talk about empathic understanding, for instance, I mentioned the redirection of attention to bodily signals. I mentioned the bodily the enhancements of bodily feelings, where you might feel better how somebody else feels. I mentioned enhancement of episodic memory. If you see a kid, um, whatever, hitting another kid, and you want to empathically understand how this kid feels, the victim, and if you can better retrieve your episodic memory of how you felt when you were hit by another kid 25 years ago or so, or 30 years ago, you will be better able, of course, to empathically connect to the kid now. So this enhanced episodic memory retrieval plays into it. Another thing I haven't mentioned here on the list is pattern recognition, and pattern recognition helps on all, which seems to be enhanced during high, helps on all levels. Pattern recognition is involved when you see my facial expression, and you see, oh, he looks happy, he looks depressed, he pays attention. This is all a pattern, a bodily posture. If I
Uh-huh.
like you see, oh, Sebastian doesn't seem to be okay right now, or maybe he needs some water. A lot of thinking is pattern recognition. Then we have enhanced creativity, which is something that I wrote a new essay on in my book, because I think that's a very complicated subject, but a very important one, because many people have reported that they have an enhancement of their creative processes during a high. Many others have reported that no, it kind of destroyed their creative output, the high. But I think that's no contradiction, because you have to learn how to deal with a high, and you
Right.
have to use cannabis as a tool. We may come back to the tool metaphor later. And then to end the list is spontaneous insights, which is a very interesting phenomenon, which is the first thing that actually sparked my interest in cannabis, is that you feel like you suddenly get those deep insights into who you are, or all kinds of things. You can't really tell where they're coming from. So I looked into the inside psychology of all this, and tried to come to a better understanding why cannabis uh, and maybe other psychoactive substances can help with that. And then the last one on the list is mental healing. As I mentioned that before, mental healing with traumatic experience of cannabis can help you to go through, remembering traumas, and then to heal, actually. And plus, maybe I add 21, which would be personal development, because cannabis can help you to see new patterns, and to have all kinds of processes that get you to a point where you feel like you have personally developed from there. it's a long
Holy
list, and
moly! It's incredible, though.
it's yeah, and it's a whole spectrum of enhancements. I never go through the list without explanations, and I know it's long, but it's I because I feel like many people uh, they need a little bit of under a better because I use technical terminology also. But when you go through the list and give some explanations and examples, a lot of people I meet who before said no enhancements, what you mean, and then they go through like, yeah, I had that, yeah, I
Yeah,
know that,
yeah.
yeah, I've been there, yes, I've done that, and so you can see suddenly, wow, there can be, and I'm not saying they necessarily come out of the high. I'm saying cannabis can be used as a tool under favorable conditions, and if you have knowledge and if you know how to dose right and how to use your cannabis varieties right, then you might experience many of them.
That's so far away from the usual typical depiction of cannabis consumption, isn't it? Typically, it'd be
Yes.
dismissed as, "Oh, he's just getting high," whereas there's all of these enhancements cognitively. Is that cognitively, or is that consciously, that can be sort of
Yeah,
tapped
I
into? I think we
if
think
you
too physically, I think, in terms of cannabis and what it maybe does to my muscle or to my joints, but we don't think
right.
about the mental
Yeah,
influences,
and
I
very
suppose.
of course, if you look in medical uses, very often people want want to have something that doesn't change your mind or doesn't actually affect or is not psychoactive because they, for instance, if you have chronic pain, uh, a lot more people would want to have something that doesn't affect their consciousness, understandably so, but then you see also in the medical world that many people benefit from some of those enhancements, like
Yeah.
I said, hyperfocus of attention, um, traumatic experiences. You can think of thinking of that list, psychotherapy for psychotherapy or even psychoanalysis. You can think of many uses, positive uses of that. But we also have a lot of disorders like mental disorders, tic disorders, for instance, Tourette's or others, where you could see, or depression, where you could see, or anxiety, where you could see that some, not maybe an anxiety CBD might be better than THC, and of course it's a matter of dosing because if you dose too high, you shouldn't use THC. You get even more anxious. That's for sure. You might have a panic attack. Yes, that can also happen. So you need to know what you're doing, and I always keep on reminding people that I'm not saying those enhancements come out of cannabis. Cannabis has a potential and it can be used as a tool, but that's like a hammer. I can say a hammer has a potential with which you can build a house, but that doesn't mean that you can hit your thumb with it and hurt yourself, or that you attack another person with it. So you can abuse it in various ways, and that's a very simple lesson, but many people haven't, grasped it in the realm of when it comes to
Hmm.
this.
I guess then, Sebastian, this brings me on to another question, and I'll phrase this quite as clearly as I possibly can. Um, how is it that you think cannabis is affecting the endocannabinoid system, and those alterations in the endocannabinoid system lead to those changes in consciousness and mental states? What's your theory of how that, I guess, mechanism sort of works, or the relationship between the body, the cannabis plant, and then the conscious experience of that? Does that make sense? Have
Yeah,
I?
yeah, yeah, totally. Um, I believe, well, first of all, the endocannabinoid system, you always need to introduce it because we're talking about it like we know, everybody, or we believe everybody knows what we're talking about, but a lot of people
Yeah.
haven't still never heard of it. And we just have to look at it this way. The endocannabinoid system evolved around and correct me if I'm wrong with something. You have studied that thing longer, probably, but I'd say, as far as I know, it's 5 to 600 million years old, evolutionary speaking, which we know because we can see it already, the beginnings of it in sea squirts and in very evolutionary, very ancient organisms. Um, and It's active in all animals except for insects. And so we all have an endocannabinoid system, and it doesn't matter if we've ever touched a cannabis plant or smoked or inhaled or ingested. We have a system in our brain and in our bodies. We have receptors and chemicals that act on these receptors, anandamide and 2-AG, which are produced in our body, and they act on CB1, CB2, which are the endocannabinoid receptors. Maybe there are more receptors in there, and there is an endocannabinoidome, because this system is embedded in other receptor systems. And I always explain to people, I take the angle of saying, okay, we know that there's endorphin system. People have heard about that, which has functions of course, in the control of pain and reward and other functions. And the endorphin system is stimulated by substances such as heroin very strongly, because or opioids in general, coming from plants or synthetic opioids. And so whatever you see from the opioid in reactions in the body is because it's mainly mediated through a system that's already there, and that's already there to control various functions like pain, etc., and or rewards, etc. So the endocannabinoid system was found later. So the opioid system was, I think, as far as I know, discovered in the 70s. The endocannabinoid system was discovered in the 90s, mostly the mid-late 90s. And so even the doctors don't know it, because they didn't learn about it in their medical education. Some of them never heard about it, even though it's probably, as we know now, one of the most important homeostatic systems. Homeostatic meaning delivering balance. And that's a very important thing to know, is that the endocannabinoid system, with its retrograde signaling in the brain, probably controls a lot of function, helps the neurotransmitter functions, and helps to balance functions. So we all need homeostasis. We all need, for instance, a certain body temperature. And if it gets colder outside, your body needs to react, it needs to perceive that, and it needs to turn up the volume on some processes that keep your temperature stable in an environment where the temperature isn't stable. So that's homeostasis, that is balance. And when it comes to main functions, we already from the distribution patterns and from stories of patients and from some really deep research, we know that the endocannabinoid system is involved in functions of memory, for instance. There is magnificent research by Beat Lutz and others on the endocannabinoid system being very important for how we deal with aversive memories or traumatic memories. If we have a traumatic memory, think about it, what we need to do with it. Evolutionary speaking, if you run into a tiger and you've never seen that thing before, or that animal, you say, okay, I'm going to beat that with a stick, that looks tasty, and the tiger almost kills you. You get a big hit with a prank or so, and then with a claws, and then you almost die from that. How should you deal with that memory, with that traumatic memory? So there are two extremes. Either you never enter that jungle again. So now this jungle may be the source of food for you, and you stay in the desert, you die, you don't get your food out. So that's an extreme post-traumatic syndrome reaction. The other extreme reaction would be the next day you forget about it and you're like, I try again. So you're not a good survival model, probably, because the second time probably you won't survive that encounter. So a better reaction for the post-traumatic memory is to say, okay, I'm going to stay away from that jungle maybe for 10 days and think about what happened there. And then um, your trauma, kind of your emotional reaction to that event fades slowly away. It's not, and you don't forget the event, and you know that it was unpleasurable, and you still remember tigers as being something dangerous, but it's not like the trauma is not so big that you never enter the jungle again. It turns out that there is a system in your body that's responsible for the weakening of aversive memories, and this is the endocannabinoid system, which is probably why cannabinoids help you if you eat cannabinoids from a plant, or if you inhale them in interaction with that system. This is probably why they help veterans to
Yeah.
deal with their traumatic memories. So that's a hypothesis still, but it's, I think if you look at the numbers, it's a pretty good
Seems to
guess.
make sense, yeah.
So we know that the endocannabinoid system, and I only give that one example, there is already functional research. We know from the distribution of where the endocannabinoid receptors are in the brain, and there are a lot of receptors in the brain, in the neurocortex, and that it's involved and implicated in various cognitive functions, memory functions. We already have some deep research. But of course, what I'm doing here is basic research. And if we're talking about creativity or about introspection or empathy, it's not like we have a neurological theory, or we know where that happens in the brain. There are rough theories about how specialized neurons could provide that ability, etc. But it's all at the beginning. But if you look at my list, I'd say it becomes pretty clear that the endocannabinoid system might be involved in the architecture of maybe even higher cognition, as pattern recognition and creativity and all those things that enable us to perceive, to empathically understand other people, etc. And fundamental seems to be going on. And so my hypothesis in my new book is that the endocannabinoid system might play a huge role in cognition and in the understanding of the architecture, and might be really, so to say, built into the architecture of higher cognitive abilities, such as introspection, empathic understanding, pattern recognition, body perception, etc. And that people should, it's a hypothesis, but I think I have some good reasons to come up with it and to claim it. But I think we should look now into how like, if I go back to my list, how cannabis acts on attention, etc., and that would help us to come up with a better understanding of the more complicated and the more complex cognitive abilities.
Based on your experience then, Sebastian, what or where or how do you see, what's your mental image of consciousness? How do you sort of picture it? How do you sort of envisage it? What's your sort of mental model that you use for trying to sort of put these pieces together? Because they're all quite ethereal in a way. It's not like a leg or a bicep muscle that you can measure the contractile strength of. How do you start measuring that? How do you start interpreting it, and how do you envisage it yourself? What's your sort of mental model perspective on how that sort of forms together, or sort of arises from the biology of the brain, I suppose?
Yeah, well, if you look into modern consciousness research, and from perspective of somebody also in the philosophy of mind, it's clear that we have a multi-perspectival um, view on consciousness coming from various areas, from psychology, from psychoanalysis, from from the neurosciences, from cognitive sciences, from evolutionary biology, which is a late revolution in the mind sciences because um, evolutionary theory was, accepted uh, like a long time ago, but it took much longer for scientists in the mind sciences to understand and to accept that everything we see in psychology and everything that happens in the mind is the outcome of a long evolutionary process. So mental processes have to be described in terms of on the background of evolutionary psychology and biology. So I think my approach to researching the high, as well as my approach to researching consciousness, is very interdisciplinary, and I wouldn't be able to put that in short terms, because also it's not a complete picture. As you know,
Yeah.
nobody really knows how. If you look into empathic understanding, for instance, I went to the States to do research in the late '90s, and that's where people came up with a certain simulation theory that said to understand somebody else, you don't only have to come up and apply a certain kind of theory that might be folk psychology or more advanced psychology, but you have to be able to simulate the other person in terms of um, really putting yourself in the moccasins of somebody else. You use your imagination to take his or her point of view, and this is a different mental ability than just to have a theory describing other people, how they act, and to explain their behavior, etc. And that is still an ongoing debate. And then on that theory, people jumped on, like from the neurosciences, and said, "Oh, we found, or we think there are neurons which are specialized, some motor neurons which are specialized in helping us to simulate other people, etc." So, so these are all debates where you can see that um, uh, people come in from all kinds of sciences. It's an interesting kind of debate because they all have different language, they all have different conceptual
Mm.
frameworks. So it's a real diverse field of people talking to each other. And for a long time, there was an arrogance from the people who came from philosophy and psychology, who would say, like, neuroscience has nothing to tell us. We know our
Yeah.
thing, and neuroscience can, that's a material science, and we are talking about the mind, which is different. And then came the arrogance from neuroscientists who said, no, you're gone. We talk about, we have the empirical science, and we come up with theories. And now I think we are at a time where people understand that no, we all have to listen to each other and see how we converge and integrate knowledge from other fields to come up with a better and more complete of consciousness. And this is basically also where my research comes in, which is not only, and my research, I think it's special. I called it the New Guinea approach to researching the cannabis high, because I'm not only integrating um, other scientific disciplines, but I'm also integrating knowledge from fields, like reports from people who illegally use cannabis, from growers who were illegal on the market. Because then, if you don't understand the genetics of what's on the market and reports about those genetics, you don't understand exactly what they're talking about. You don't understand how to evaluate anecdotal reports. So I call my research more interfield, and it's New Guinea means that Guinea stands for a new, is because I think it's kind of a new investigation. It draws on a lot of reports, but also studies. It draws on science. It draws on cognitive sciences. It draws on neurosciences, and it tries to integrate all that kind of information to come up with hypotheses. And the Guinea stands for Guerrilla Neurophilosophical. So it's guerrilla because it also goes into fields of experiences where people on the black market, or have had more insights into plant genetics and what is actually in the cannabis variety, and then um, but you also go into neurophilosophy, meaning the part of philosophy where philosophers are trying to interact with neurologists and people from the neurosciences to come up with theories about the most complicated and about the most complex abilities and
Mm.
cognitive abilities we have.
Wow. I'm very much enjoying this, Sebastian. So thank you for walking us through all of these elements.
Right, hear that.
Um, I'm gonna maybe throw out an idea because it sort
Yeah,
of relates to current
go away.
events, consciousness and computers, and if I may, this is sort of how I envisage how that could potentially arise. So, computers, we've got the hardware, the actual physical machine. Within that, we've then got the software, could be considered sort of the DNA of the computer, hardware, the body, internet, and all of that data. Could that be where consciousness arises in some of these new AI models, or potentially through some of those elements that you've described there about sort of pattern recognition, focus, and then if we start giving some of these computers different sensory tools as well. I
Right.
know we were talking earlier on about philosophy of computer consciousness as well. I'd love to hear your theories on how some of that maybe arises, what that might look like if they do then become sentient. Do they have rights? What it opens up a whole sort of wormhole, doesn't it? I don't want to go too far down the
Yeah,
rabbit hole, but
yeah,
would you
but
be able
it's
to?
interesting you asked it because I just appeared on a German podcast. We recorded that on Friday, and the same topic came up because, and I think it is a topic that is very interesting when it comes to, and it's not separated from the cannabis and from the my research about cannabis. Um, First, my take on AI is that right now what we're seeing is are like really the advances are breathtaking, and I've like I mentioned that before, that I looked into the whole field of questions around could computers develop consciousness. The metaphor you gave of a computer with hardware you software you run on that, it has been turned upside down basically in the computers, or in the when you look at artificial intelligence, it runs on a different paradigm with neurological with networks, connectionist networks that are more closer to the architecture of the brain. So
Mm,
um, 30, 40 years ago, people came up saying, no, if we want to simulate cognitive functions and thinking, we shouldn't go into just sentence crunching, so to say, just linguistically using computers to and then with logics manipulate sentences, etc., and draw a conclusion. But we should actually look at the architecture of the brain and look at how neurons are connected and um, how they communicate with each other, and then simulate that with what is now called connectionist networks, and simulate the brain in a different way. And what you're seeing now, the the radical advances you have in artificial intelligence is built on that paradigm of neural networks. Like when you look at chess computers or AlphaGo or other or ChatGTP, and they take huge amounts of data, and they work in a completely different paradigm, and they can learn differently than the old school computer could have done. So now, question briefly. I mean, there are all kinds of questions about, could computers become creative? Could they have feelings in the sense of can they have a body and then report on their feelings, etc. Could they become conscious, and would that have moral and ethical consequences for us having to attribute a personality to them? Well, I think this is a debate I was specialized on for more than 10 years. I mean,
Mm.
the whole qualia, so-called qualia issue in philosophy, and if computers could develop consciousness, or at which point does look at how important they are. These questions are. They seem a little bit ethereal and be like, okay, that's very theoretical stuff. But if you look at which point does a baby develop or an embryo develop consciousness, and at which point do we have to treat it as having a personality or with personal rights, human rights? At which point do we have to, like, if somebody is in a coma, is he still a person? Is he still alive? Can we turn the body off if the brain's not working anymore? What do we think about this type of consciousness? And so these are important questions for us as a society. And of course, if it comes to artificial intelligence, I would predict, and we're seeing that in some areas right now already, but further on in 5 to 10 years, we will have, let's say, robots taking care of people. And at some point, the robot will go outside and say, and you're going to be going after the robot and telling the robot, hey, uh, Mrs. Graff needs more, or Mrs. Graham needs attention, and could you, and the robot is going like, I'm depressed because of the way I have to deal with people here. I don't have enough time, and I would like to look more into the psyche of, and you're like, holy cow, are you going to be like, holy cow, that's a good system? Or are you going to be like, holy cow, maybe this, whatever I made there, which is not, and we're talking about very processes that even the programmers, and that's happening today, they don't understand anymore internally what these systems are doing, because they're learning all the time. And from an architectonically standpoint, even those who have built the system at some point don't know anymore what the system is doing really, and they don't. And of course, there will be behaviors evolving and coming out of that at some point a lot of us would want to attribute consciousness to, or personality. Plus, at this point, and I know, I don't know all the new arguments, but I know a lot of the arguments in that arena, and I'd say from a philosophical standpoint, we don't have strong arguments right now to say that artificial intelligence could never become conscious. It probably will happen at some point. I don't think it's happening right now based on those systems, and it's certainly not something similar to what we are experiencing, because most systems we're talking about right now, they don't have a body, they don't have sensors in their bodies, they're not embodied in the sense we are, which is probably makes up a large part of what we see in consciousness, but they will be embodied, and this will change, and there will be new materials, etc., etc. And so we are in a situation right now where we are facing, it's difficult to tell a time scale, but we're facing a situation where we will have computers, robots, acting in a way that we usually would think, okay, now I have to grant personal rights, and nobody will have a good argument for or against it, really. So at which point, some people say, yeah, it's just a matter of time. We will get used to it. And at some point, we will attribute those things, even not knowing if this robot has an internal life, so to say, if the light switch had turned on consciousness. But I think it's a very interesting debate. So that's my general take on at least that aspect of AI. There's so many aspects to talk about. But now what is interesting in terms of cannabis, my cannabis research, is that I once said that the interesting point about cannabis is that it enhances what we believe to be the crucial core defining human mental abilities: creativity, empathic understanding, our ability to introspect, to see patterns, to generate great insights, to connect with other people, imagination. These are things that we usually think set us apart from most other animals. I mean, animals are capable of empathic understanding to some degree, and of creativity to some degree, but we seem to be far out there with various of those mental abilities, and these are the abilities that are seem to be enhanced by cannabis or under certain conditions. So cannabis research or the research of psychoactive substances, to put it in more general terms, because this applies to other psychedelics, might give us a glimpse of what is the nature of what is the core nature of our human mind, what defines us as humans, and because we all have to face the question of what are we going to do in a few decades if computers take on creative jobs, and they are already to some extent creative. What if they take away a lot of the jobs we have, which we might feel is threatening, but then again we might feel that, yeah, I don't need to have jobs for cleaning toilets or repetitive jobs for counting or so. Who fucking needs that? So now let's imagine a situation where you have the sunlight hitting a lot of things that, or you get energy, renewable energy, a lot from the sun, from the wind, from everywhere. We don't need to work anymore to collect that. Once we have the collectors out there and we have the technology, which could already happen now, and then we have robots turning and doing most of the work that needs to be done. Then somebody's banging. If we have all that, where are we as humans?
Yeah.
So I can't identify. My identity doesn't come out of being. I mean, even look at scientists. I mean, there are already artificial intelligence. I read an essay that an artificial. I think it wasn't ChatGPT. It was something else that made an introductory scientific essay that was accepted by a magazine as scientific. The magazine editors didn't know where it was coming from, so they said, yeah, this could be a scientific article. So very soon we're going to be in a situation where artificial intelligence writes and comes up with scientific articles and research that needs to be attributed somewhere. And so where are we then as humans? Who do we want to be? Do we want to be pole dancers for perverse artificial intelligence systems who like to look down on us and treat us as slaves? Could be. Or what do we want to do, and who are we? If we come back, okay, if I don't have to work anymore as marketing director or whatever, or as an author, a book author, if artificial intelligence, let's imagine that artificial intelligence can take over most of those functions. Where do we want to go from there as humans? What is our core? What interests? Where do we want to? What is the development, the personal development we want to have, or what are we? Where do we want to be? If most of those things that we now do, but could be done by an artificial intelligence. And now, so this is why I think looking into how cannabis can affect core human abilities, helping us to find out about core human abilities, might be part of the debate of how are we going to deal with artificial intelligence rising and with finding a place for ourselves in that world.
Could that computer consciousness then have psychoactive experiences as well? Would that be? Would you simulate that? It's a strange.
Yes, and I'm totally. Why not? I mean, why not? Because, and here's the thing. Actually, I don't want to talk about it too much because you're taking an idea of mine for a science.
Oh yeah, no.
I had a long time ago, but I still need to write it. But the thing is this. I believe that if you look into altered states of consciousness, we are all living a wrong paradigm. We believe humans are logical thinkers, rational thinkers, and this is what defines our being. But look at who we are.
Yeah.
We go through altered states of consciousness every day, and they make a a significant part of what we believe to be meaningful in our lives. Dreaming, of course, is a weird psychedelic state to be in, and it inspires us in all kinds of ways. And this is part of our nature. Our brain has mechanisms that transform our consciousness every day, and we are transformed into a being that is perceiving the environment differently, that is more concerned with whatever happened in our past, is very imaginative, and is in a weird state. So that's one thing. Second, orgasm, for instance. Orgasm is an altered state of mind that we would all think is very important, or ecstasy, like orgasm as part of ecstasy, ecstatic experiences as in dancing or whatever. Look at hypnotic experiences when you're in aesthetic, hypnotic experience of you see a huge waterfall, you're in an environment, in a beautiful landscape, and you're suddenly hypnotized by the beauty of the landscape, by that waterfall, and you come into a state of maybe also ecstasy, or in a state of deep connection with nature, which is also a different state of, then you have those states of like being half awake, half dreaming, where a lot of scientists have said that they then came up with great ideas. You have trance states where you start dancing, or you start drumming, or you have other forms of inducing a trance state. You have meditation states, which are also altered state of consciousness. So we are all, as humans, going through various states of consciousness, and it seems that as human beings, and again, we're what is our human nature? Is our human nature only like being the logical beings? Well, I think we wrongly believe so, because when we talk about human nature now, when we verbalize it, we are in that state of mind, and it's hard to remember sleep or dreaming, because it's as cognitive scientists would say, state specific. It's hard for me in a state of wakefulness to remember my high or my sleep or something, because it's a different mental state. So we always, in philosophy or in the sciences, we reconstruct our nature from a point of view of logical thinking and wakefulness and rational thinking, but so that's a systematic error, I think, because humans are, every night we're sleeping 8 hours. Every day, or very often we go through, when I'm in front of a computer and I'm absorbed in the virtual world, this is a different state sometimes, or when I'm watching a movie, etc., etc. And so there's this kind of absorption in the virtual world. So this is, I think this is a really important discussion and an important angle on altered states of consciousness, that we need to understand that they are part of our nature, and maybe, and that they may play part in what we perceive in the world, and what we are able to do, and what we're creatively able to do. And maybe a future artificial intelligence is also built on not being in one conscious mode, but maybe goes through various states of consciousness that are later than integrated, or and maybe yes, there is an artificial intelligence that says that once in a while it needs to drop LSD to come up with better insights. Possible, or that these are built-in states where it says, okay, I need to go dreaming, or I need to go, let's call it dreaming with T, and then the system goes in a state where it can't really explain to you what it does, but it does something, or it is in a state of consciousness that we don't even know, that we have no clue what it is.
Yeah.
We can describe it maybe, or it can describe it to us. I love that book by, there's a book from, and I mentioned that in the other podcast, my favorite science fiction author, Stanislav Lem. You know Stanislav Lem because he was from Poland. You studied in Poland. Have you ever heard of Stanislav Lem?
I'm gonna Google him quickly now.
He wrote this for instance, the book it was a Tarkovsky movie. Then Clooney made it, produced another Solaris movie, and he wrote a book called in German Also sprach Golem. I'm not sure what the English translation would be,
Mm-hmm.
and it's about it's about a super. It was written in the 80s, and it's about a supercomputer golem who's giving lectures to mankind, and he Lem speaks through Golem, and he gives all his wisdom because he knew a lot about cybernetics and about evolutionary biology, etc., etc. He was like a real genius. But also the funny part is that where Golem is a little bit arrogant, and it always goes like, yeah, I'm trying to explain that to you guys, but I'm aware of the fact that you're thinking more metaphorically, and you're not really intelligent. So I'm going to break it down for you. So I'm going to simplify it to a point where it's ridiculous. But okay, here we go. And then there's another supercomputer. I think it's Annie in the book. And Annie also was built by humans to, serve with various kind of computations. But Annie doesn't talk to humans anymore because Annie finds it ridiculous to talk to humans, and it finds that the task is not interesting enough. So Annie is concerned with questions that humans wouldn't even understand. So Golem sometimes talks to Annie and tries to get people to understand what Annie does, but and we might see as well forms of consciousness, artificial consciousness that we don't understand, or artificial consciousness that goes through cycles as we do as humans, of psychedelic experiences, of dreaming, or of states could be called in that arena. So that's going to happen, and we're going to be prepared.
Question for you then again, Sebastian, sort of bringing this back round to the cannabis industry. How is the industry performing in the grand scheme of all of this knowledge? My perspective is maybe about 5% of the knowledge that we have available to us is actually being used and applied in the cannabis industry. What problems is the cannabis industry facing, in your perspective? How is it sort of holding itself back, and what opportunities does that maybe present us as well in the next sort of 5 to 10 years? Because a lot of this information is available, but not necessarily mainstream yet, or within the sort of perspective or understanding of decision makers at the heads of companies who are investing money. What's your take on that?
Well, the cannabis industry is in a constant struggle as it is facing changes in lawmaking, which are great opportunities, and there are so many nuances in new regulations, and in opening up to that plant that make a huge difference to a market. So, just an example, the German legalization process now, where we recently found out, we were all hopeful, we recently found out that there are not going to be, it's not going to be a full legalization in terms of that we're going to have stores selling to adults for responsible use. That's not going to happen within the next 5 years, I guess. But even if, for instance, they have all kinds of other things they want to do, decriminalize cannabis and make, 25 grams, so to say, take it off the list, and you could have as a user 25 grams or 3 pounds, etc. Let's see if that all comes. But even if you only, let's say in Germany, you'd only change one thing about traffic law, where you have, because right now we have really, really strict regulations on how much cannabis you can consume. Because if they find very, very low levels of a certain cannabinoid or a degradation product thereof in your bloodstream, you get busted for it. If they change that to a value that would be argued by toxicologists to make sense, that would make a huge change, because a lot more people would feel comfortable knowing that they can, whatever, smoke a joint, and the next day they can drive without having,
Yeah.
to be afraid that they get busted for something which makes no sense at all. So that, of course, is a situation which is going to be persistent in the next years, because very often when we talk about legalization, people think of a switch, so it's either on or off. No, legalization, first of all, is a misnomer, because it doesn't mean that you're going to make it legal for everything, for everybody. It's not going to be legal to distribute synthetic cannabinoids in the kindergarten anytime, hopefully. Um, so it's a regulation. So it's, first of all, it's a new regulation of cannabinoids. It's the end of the prohibition that makes no sense.
Mm-hmm.
But it's a gradual regulation, and which comes with many consequences for medical cannabis, for CBD, for THC, for synthetic cannabinoids. There all need to be different regulations for those realms, and and that opens up, of course, in the cannabis industry, which is still highly restricted by advertising laws and other laws, advertises for the entrepreneurs and for those who are adventurous always the possibility of running out and doing their pump and dump scheme, because they can come up and say, hey, we sell product X, an extract, whatever, and you guys invest in that, and next year there's going to be a new law or new regulation or new country opening up to the use of blah blah blah, and so you're going to have a return of invest which is going to be huge. I've seen that happening in the cannabis industry in 2017, when they were a lot more optimistic about what would happen in Canada with what would happen in 2018 with the legalization and with adult use being allowed. And so there are, in the cannabis industry, there are a lot of people who are really running pump and dump schemes, meaning we come out with a company, we do all kinds of maybe even criminal activities to make people believe that this is going to be the next big thing in the world. It already happened very often, and then the company that those people starting the company run away with millions or more, and the company breaks down and the investors have lost their money. Now, we are still, if you look at how all the at the stock market and how even the bigger companies fared, because many people thought, okay, they don't run those schemes and they're going to be okay. You have to say there was way too much optimism. There was a lot of mismanagement on the sides of even the bigger companies, and of course it was not all foreseeable, and they're not all fraudsters, but there was a lot of this self-hypnosis that you talk yourself into a rage, and
Yeah.
you want that, you generate that frenzy. And I think this is a huge problem for the whole industry right now, that they've lost the trust of investors, and this is and they should, because the industry now, I think, all of us who are in it, all of us who know more about the endocannabinoid system, what I said before, and about cannabis as being the emergent new kid on the block what concerns medicine. It's not a new kid on the block, it's been there for thousands of years, but it's like,
Yeah.
we see we see it coming back again. All know that this market is going to grow and grow and grow and grow. And Canada, you already see, I'm not sure where exactly we're now with patients. I think we have 550,000 patients. We have other countries from which we can deduce that 1% of the population or even more will benefit from medical cannabis. So if you look at Germany, that would be more than 800,000 patients. Right now I think we have like 100,000 or so. It's really hard to extract the numbers, but we're in that league. So the market, medically speaking, even if you don't look at the adult use market, will go up. But there are so many people in there who don't know what they're doing, and they say, the endocannabinoid system, therefore it works, and therefore it's, and then they don't give detailed information, but they only want to go out to investors and tell them why this thing is going to go up. Now, the market is gonna explode. It's gonna there are gonna be a lot more patients. There are gonna be a lot more countries opening up to adult use, but a lot of investors are gonna lose more money. And I think what we now need in this industry has already a lot of people in it who came from a civil rights perspective, who were working probably in an illegal field as growers or activists, and they were facing the whole irrational take of the society they lived in, and had to deal with it to manage to get whatever their medication to patients they knew would benefit from it, or to be able to experience the enhancements that I was talking about, etc. And and now I think we need in that industry um, people who are thinking about how to make sure that those who are abusing that whole market, those who came in to just pump and dump and make money on it without caring, how do we destroy that market if we run away with those millions, with the money from investors? We need to think, or those people in that industry need to think about how they police, so to say, their own sector, or how they built infrastructures, testing, etc., so that investors gain back their trust. Because this is not only a story about how investors lose their money, which is sad for those investors, and a lot of them are struggling, and they put a lot of money in it, which was supposed to be, and for a good reason. I mean, many of them really wanted to do something good with that money. And this is not only a sad story about those investors, about those companies breaking down those employees, but this is a really sad story. And it's when you look at the epic suffering of patients who are out there who yet don't have access to cannabinoids, and others who might benefit in terms of personal growth and other things from using cannabis, in terms of those who are still criminalized, in terms of the money we're losing in taxes, in terms of the chances we're losing to really educate and protect younger people. This causes, and those people who ran with the money and come in that market and destroyed the trust in that market of other investors, they're holding it, and they are really responsible for epic suffering. And I think this is the perspective we need to keep in mind, and we need to, as an industry, think about how can we struggle, because for a long time the struggle was against irrational politics, irrational governments. And now it needs to be broader, and it needs to be, yes, we need to educate doctors about the endocannabinoid system, about the research coming out, etc., and we need to educate the wider public, but also we need to guard ourselves against criminal activities within this sector, which is complicated to do because the regulations are still missing. When you look at CBD or so, there is a lot of gray areas. I mean, it's highly regulated in the pharmaceutical realm, but even there was a lot of criminal activity. So I think that industry needs to think about, there were already those people who came in and fought against the stigma in society and fought for years, and they need to go back on stage, I think. And the industry needs to remind itself that it needs an ethical core. It needs to come back and make sure that investors know how and where to put their money so that they can help patients and others to benefit from this amazing plant.
On the note of some of those grey areas, Sebastian, and how those grey areas may be influenced by other industries, other commercial forces, other industrial forces, could you, my new favourite area of discussion, talk a little bit about agnotology and the role that that's playing in some of the shaping of the cannabis industry narrative, and by proxy the sort of downstream effects of being able to alter the perceived reality in different ways. I hope that makes sense as well, without being too vague of a question.
Yeah, agnotology is an interesting topic because we talked about that before we went on that conversation.
Yeah, completely introduced me to the whole phenomena.
Yeah, agnotology is within the sociology of knowledge is a field that was became more or less invented in the early 90s. And Robert Proctor at Stanford University is probably the most important name in that field as far as I know. And it comes from the notion agnos from not knowing, and maybe it could be translated as the story of not knowing. And Proctor was one of his main examples, and I think that there was his research was focused on was what the tobacco industry did in the 50s and 60s with upcoming studies that basically showed that tobacco smoking leads to all type of cancers, which became a real problem for that industry. At some point, they came to the conclusion that they cannot just address this with the usual type of PR, just the usual PR tricks in public relations, but that they would have to actually destroy knowledge. So what do I mean by destroy knowledge or by affecting scientific knowledge? They started, basically one of the tricks was to start all kinds and to fund all kinds of studies, methodologically speaking, usually poorly designed, and to flood the scientific world with studies on tobacco with no clear outcome, or little studies where you'd say, you couldn't really find a causal relationship between that kind of tobacco smoking and cancer. And so before, at some point in the 50s, it was clear, or 90-something% of the studies said, okay, it's not clearly established. Now you flooded the market with badly designed studies that said, that were then also spin doctored in the public, and then suddenly you have a situation where you're like, you have 1,000 studies that say it causes cancer, but there are 1,200 studies that say it doesn't cause cancer, or 1,000 studies that say it can't be really said. And then you have a situation where you say, okay, it's not that clear, is it? And so this is about the sociology, the agnotology is about how big companies started to work on that to dilute what was already more or less known. And a good example would be the knowledge we had on climate change and human-made climate change, because we've seen the same activity in that arena where, all kinds of stakeholders, all kinds of people who didn't want to have us understand that climate change comes from the overuse of oil, etc. And that they wanted to also have people destroy that kind of knowledge by coming up with studies, etc. So I think we need the agnotology perspective and to understand that this is happening not only, or this happened not only with the tobacco industry and with the with climate change, but it's happening all around us. That big, huge entities, companies, are able to influence what is scientifically published. I give you just one nuance which I learned is that, for instance, if you want to come up, if you want to, you want to introduce, whoops,
Still here.
okay, if you want to introduce a pharmacon, a new substance on the pharmaceutical market, and as a pharmaceutical company that it leads to liver damage, and you want to spin that, you go to one of those labs that deliver rats for studies, for animal studies. And they have they have different kinds of genetic makeups and families of those rats. So you choose a rat that is that is very persistent, that is very resistant in its liver reaction to certain type of chemicals. You make a study with that rat, which comes out with, okay, it's not that bad, and then you distribute that study and make sure it comes out big in PR, big in the newspapers, etc. And so you kind of dilute and destroy the knowledge that we had. This chemical can be really dangerous for whatever. Having some kind of damaging effect on your liver. So, so this is happening, and we have to know and understand the mechanisms, and we already know a lot about how the prohibition, and this is in my new book, Cannabis as a Mind-Enhancing Tool.
We'll put the link in the description.
Yeah. It's also, I have a chapter on the prohibition, and I talk a little bit about prohibitions and why they happen, because usually people think a prohibition happened because a substance was dangerous. And of course, it makes sense to prohibit a dangerous substance and to make sure that all citizens are safe, but usually, and it's not only the cannabis prohibition, prohibitions are not happening because of the toxicity of a certain substance. Might play a role in the story, but it's usually also that a government, a party, or king wants to suppress a certain group of people and to prohibit a certain substance that is used by that certain group of people is always a good way of getting them out of the picture, and by really not allowing them to participate or to spread their news. So agnotology plays a huge role also in the understanding of what's happening in science, for instance, with cannabis. And I use a very strong metaphor. If let's say there is a new neighbor coming to your village, and you read in the newspaper, and you from the mayor, from various other neighbors, you all hear the story that this guy is a sexual predator. He killed even some kids, and so he lives in the house next to you. Now, do you let your kids walk through his garden or by his garden to school? Well, you'd probably be like, take the other route. Now, let's say your neighbor comes 2 weeks later and says, hey, I heard that those stories are not true about them. This is actually a really nice guy. I talked to him. Would you now let your kids walk through the garden in the evening or so when you'd still be like, no. Now you hear that the report of the newspaper that reported on his being a predator and killing people was also not true, because it came out of a report of his ex-wife who was angry with him.
Yeah.
Now what's your attitude? You're still going to be, if you're a good parent, you're still going to be like, yeah, but maybe
any risk isn't worth it. Yeah.
So what do you need now? Now you are you are in a context. This guy is in a context now. Usually, if you wouldn't have heard anything about that guy, you'd be like, yeah, our kids can walk by. You wouldn't even think about it. Now, this guy has found himself in a context where he has to bring the super highest standard of proof. You'd have to hear from the police, from the mayor, from the newspapers, from others, from neighbors. You'd have to talk to him until you come to the point that you would trust him to not being dangerous to your kids. It would take an eternity. Maybe you wouldn't even end up at that point because you're like, okay, now if there's even like a tiny little bit true, and this is the situation, I think, because of the targeted disinformation campaigns about cannabis, that cannabis finds itself in a situation, in a context where you not only have to tell people about the background and how it got discredited the way it did from the 30s on, but even before,
right,
what the struggles were. But there are so many bad myths connected to cannabis. If you go, and they're different in each country. If you go to maybe Poland or Russia, people think that it's genetically changing your kids or damaging the genetic code of your kids. Of course, some people are worried about it being strongly addictive, which isn't true. It can be addictive to a certain point, but et cetera, et cetera. You have to really look at what the science is about it. But so there are so many bad myths connected to cannabis that it's really a huge effort to give people the background. And in science also, because for doctors, for the medical science, I've seen that in conferences, especially in Germany, if there are so many studies that are methodologically flawed about for instance, the connection between cannabis and psychosis or schizophrenia, which doesn't mean that cannabis can't lead to states, shouldn't be used, or at least THC, you should be careful, etc., etc. I'm not going to go into that too long, but there are a lot of stories about where you hear that cannabis could actually lead to schizophrenia, etc., which are completely wrong and over-exaggerated. And because of that, doctors, and you see, they refrain from using cannabinoids, even if they know that cannabis can help for instance, chronic pain. They wouldn't touch it because they think it's highly addictive and it leads to schizophrenia or psychosis, etc. In Germany, I've seen that with the medical community, and so that is a problem. And I think the science of agnotology sounds horrible. It sounds a little bit like Scientology, but it's a true science, and it's the sociology of knowledge. And if you look a little bit more into that, you understand why cannabis is where it is now, and why people are still so skeptical, why people in the scientific community, in the medical community, and in the wider public still want evidence that they wouldn't want for anything else. But even if there's the last possible doubt about cannabis making, turning my kid into a schizophrenic, then I wouldn't even touch it. So
yeah,
you understand that better if you look into the science of agnotology.
It's quite scary when you think about how easy it is to sort of, when we're contemplating such scales of wealth, influence, power almost, it's really quite scary to think about what else could be influenced in nefarious ways, how you can sort of skew reality in a way for large populations of people, citizens, and almost nudge them in directions that aren't actually in their interests. And when you introduced me to that term, it's something that it's pretty evident, but I didn't know that there was an actual field of study or
I only learned about this through a documentary that I watched, I think last year or so, on Arte, the TV channel Arte. It was a brilliant documentation on it, and I was like, wow. So that's been around since the 90s, and I haven't heard of it. So I keep on telling everybody who's approaching cannabis from, or the whole who has to deal with the prohibition, because as far as I know, the people, agnotologists in that circle, haven't looked at themselves, haven't looked at the cannabis prohibition. I think it would be a great dissertation thesis for somebody who's working in that field. But but of course, we have all kinds of other sources of people who haven't who haven't or conceived themselves as agnotologists, but who have uncovered what happened during the prohibition times. Yeah. So.
Where can people best get in touch with you, Sebastian? Where I know you've got a very wonderful LinkedIn page, but where on the internet are people best? Well, where are the best chances of them finding you and getting in touch with you, Sebastian?
Well, I have a website, sebastianmarincolo.de, and you find all my books on there. Like I said, Elevated is my last book. It's a popular scientific treatment of my research, and the latest, so to say. And I'm really proud of it because it appeared, because Hilaritas Press published it in the States, and Hilaritas Press is the publishing house of Robert Anton Wilson's daughter, Christina, and Rasa, who was helping her. And they are just an amazing team, and Robert Anton Wilson was such an amazing thinker also in that realm that I'm really happy that they published this book. And before that, I published The Art of the High, which is more of a minimal guide for people. It's called The Art of the High, Your Guide to Using Cannabis for an Outstanding Life, where I try to teach people in a very minimalist way how to use cannabis, how to choose a variety, how to approach dosing, and how to choose it for those kinds of enhancements that I have described. Before that, I have a book, What Hashish Did to Walter Benjamin, which also explores, it's an essay collection which also explores how cannabis had an effect not only on individuals but also on society through its effect on people who use it, like luminaries like Walter Benjamin, the philosopher, or John Lennon and the Beatles, or who said that Paul McCartney once said that they would have never made the music without cannabis and LSD that they ended up doing, or on people like Zarathustra or the Hashish Club members, Charles Baudelaire, Alexandre Dumas Père, Victor Hugo, Arthur Rimbaud, Lord Byron, Rudyard Kipling, Mark Twain, Carl Sagan, Francis Crick, Richard Feynman, the physicist, Oliver Sacks, Lester Young. They all used. Louis Armstrong said that his biography could well be named. Said once that his biography could be named Gage, which was a code word for cannabis, and he was a daily smoker. So it's really interesting, I think, also in terms of history to see on the if you look at my research and then to see how much cannabis actually helped those people. Because the question is, for instance, like people for Louis Armstrong, did cannabis help him just to relax or to go on stage and perform high? And which turn did it, what wheel did it actually turn to help them? And I looked, for instance, with this book, I looked into the biography of one of the biographies of Billie Holiday, and she used cannabis. She would smoke to get on stage when it was still legal in the 30s, and when it became illegal, she would take a cab and smoke a joint and going around the block to get back on stage high. So you can see how it helped, how that she actually used it. And I think
some of the mind enhancement again.
And there is a story about the early evolution of jazz in that book. It's not only in Benjamin's 20 essays, and how it helped many jazz musicians to actually come up with the kind of music they came up with. And before that was a book, here is where I tried, this is what I developed, and in my new book, the photos are in there, where I tried to come up with a photo series to open people to a better understanding of cannabis. And I give you just one example of a photo here is this one. where I said, okay, I want to go back from, I want to step back from the symbol. You know, you usually see the cannabis plant, and then you have all those associations with, oh, cannabis, negative, Rasta, whatever, criminal. And if you see this, you're suddenly like, okay, this is a plant. This is a beautiful plant. And then you look at the shades and the leaves, and then you see, for instance, how they could be different, and how one variety might have a different effect. This is coming more from an indica plant, and this other from a sativa plant. Back in the day, the distinction probably doesn't make such a big sense anymore. But anyway, so this was 10 years ago. This book made a big splash in Germany, and another book is on there. But so this is all on my website, and all the a lot of podcast appearances on Sebastian Marincolo, and you find my email there, and you find me on LinkedIn. So yeah, reach out. I'm always happy if people tell me if I get feedback from readers. It has led to amazing insights. Really, I give you one. I had a guy calling a 20-year-old student who reacted to my writing on cannabis and empathy, and he said he probably had a traumatic experience in his childhood. A Saudi Arabian student at NYU, 20 years old at the time he contacted me. And he said that he always felt in his life until he was 16 that people are just an extension of himself. That's how he actually put it. So he said he felt like he's alone in the world and everybody else is like a dream or like other people. And that probably came out of his traumatic experience. And then he said that the first time he smoked cannabis, he suddenly had the feeling that he can put himself in the moccasins of other people, and that he can understand other people, and he sees that they are there. He understands that there are other people. So it's a very, very fundamental thing that seemed to have happened there. So I get really interesting feedback. So I always encourage people who listen to this podcast or who read my stuff, please get back to me if you have criticism or if you have something to tell me that you find interesting.
Definitely worth digging into some of those books if you've liked anything that we've talked about today. We didn't get a chance to touch on your creative photography background as well, which I guess has been incorporated into some of these lovely books as well.
You see it on the website too. So I have a series, The Art of Cannabis, which is already 10 years old now. But I used my high also to come because I really, 10 years ago, I thought for a long time about how can I generate images that to make people see this plant differently, to take a perspective on it. And I came up with a high perspective on cannabis where the colors are enhanced, where you have a bigger acuity and perception with techniques like deep field lighting, going with the light through the plant, macro photography, mimicking, so to say, the focus, the super focus. And then I came up with images that were also, I've sold in Amsterdam and coffee shops and other places like this, where I came up with taking photos, macro photos of the little buds. This is like maybe a 1 centimeter of cannabis bud, which gives you a complete different view of the plant, and you can explain various things about how the stigmas turn red and what happens chemically speaking. And this photography and my creative ideas of my photography allowed me to explain a lot about the plant and about its effects it has on the mind.
I guess consciousness and photography also plays a bit of a role together now, just in terms of like viewing and scoping out and presenting and shaping focus. Sebastian, that's been the most interesting podcast I think I've done, not to diminish any of the other podcasts, but just I'm really interested in the whole consciousness side of things at the moment. That's right now what I'm sort of interested in. Armchair physics as well, looking at how maybe some of the electronic elements interweave with the biological elements, but we'll have to do another one again soon, I think, and maybe go go into a bit more detail on some of the stuff that we've sort of overviewed today, but I want to say a huge thank you for taking the time to sit down with me and go through all these topics and sort of chopping and changing between a whole lifetime worth of experience. So I appreciate you taking the time to walk us through all of that, and we'll do it all again very soon. Keep up the fantastic work, and please make sure to find all of Sebastian's knowledge, contact details and information in the description of this podcast. And especially, I don't know if you've got any closing comments or things you'd like to add before we wrap up, but I've really enjoyed all of this.
Thank you for thanks for having me. It was a really great pleasure to talk to you. And I would just like to add that I hope that more people understand that this type of research is necessary not only for those who really want to use cannabis for creativity or the other enhancements that I've named here, but it's also important for generally for families, friends of patients, for doctors, for pharmacists to understand the psychoactivity of cannabis better. Because even if you only want to use it for chronic pain, you need to understand what is a cannabis high, how does it, how is it structured, what does it do to your mind, can it be used positively? Because maybe even doctors who are using it for a condition like Tourette's or so end up being like not having that attitude of
right.
Psychoactivity is shit and it's toxic or whatever, but here it helps you with your takes. But maybe they understand that cannabis might even help those people with tic disorders, with epilepsy or so, to use if they use it already. Some people develop a tolerance which is a blessing, and then they don't have many of the psychoactive effects anymore. But for some other people, if you change their attitude, they might even benefit not only from the medical aspects of treating their condition with the psychological effects, but maybe they benefit also from the psychoactive effects and can be encouraged to look at those aspects and to be like, hey, this is great medicine. This helps me to get to sleep, but maybe I get some great ideas before I get to sleep, or it helps me to feel my body better as I'm healing, or etc. What I was talking about. So I'm hoping that I can change a lot of minds about, and I can help to educate a lot of people who are already in that realm and who used to think like, we want to have that. We see that all as negative side effects. No, they're not. There are some negative side effects. You can have those detrimental effects on your memory, etc., if you're dosing too high, etc. But so my research holds the potential of showing you how you minimize those negative effects and how you benefit from the positive effects. And I think that's valuable too.
Big time. It's totally unacknowledged really at the moment. It's still, we demonize THC for its psychoactivity, but that psychoactivity has its own benefits as well. So, really interesting conversation, Sebastian, and I think a lot of people are gonna have a few thoughts provoked by what we've talked about, and I hope that we can nudge some people in a bit more of a exploratory direction and help them understand what some of this means for them and their patients, their communities as well, and children, families, everything in between. So thank you so much, Sebastian, and really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Wicked.
Thanks, Chris.
Well, on that note then, we'll wrap it up. I'll stop recording.